In this presentation, you will learn about the subaltern turn. Meaning of subaltern. The word subaltern has Latin roots whereby sub means below and alternus, all others. Subaltern is used to describe someone of a low rank, as in the military, or class, as in the caste system. Subalterns occupy entry-level jobs or occupy a lower rung of the corporate ladder. But the term is also used to describe someone who has no political or economic power, such as a poor person living under a dictatorship. Understanding subaltern perspective and its history. The Italian Marxist scholar Antonio Gramsci conceived subaltern as he was in prison for a long time. His work was subject to censorship. Hence, he used subaltern as a code word for any class of people, especially peasants and workers, subject to the hegemony of another more powerful class. The term has been adopted by a group of post-colonial studies scholars, thus forming a subdiscipline within the field known as subaltern studies. The group was founded by Southeast Asian historian Ranjit Guha, and over time it has included several other scholars like Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak, Partha Chatterjee, and Dipesh Chakrabarti. Following Gramsci's footsteps, it aims to examine the formation of subaltern classes in various settings in Southeast Asia, especially in India and its neighbors, to provide a kind of counter history to address the imbalances of official histories, which tend to focus exclusively on the affairs of the state and the ruling class. Spivak's famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, incorporated into A Critique of Postcolonial Reason, 1999, problematizes the key premises of subaltern studies, namely that the heterogeneous group of peoples classified as subaltern can have sufficient unity such that they can speak. Her answer to her question is a resolute no. The term has also been used in Latin American studies for a similar purpose. However, it is given a slightly different slant. It also refers to the habit or mindset of servitude and subservience that must be overcome to bring about political change. Subaltern studies. Writings on Indian history and society, as mentioned earlier, began in 1982 as a series of interventions from some debates while discussing modern Indian history. Ranjit Guha began it with 8 scholars from India, UK, Australia, an editorial collective called Subaltern Studies. This series now has a global presence in India as well as other parts of the world. Even post-colonial theorists have explored this dimension in their work. Subaltern studies critique history and nationalism and point out that it has Orientalism and Eurocentrism. Subaltern studies, hence, can be seen as a post-colonial project of rewriting history. While writing history, the relationship between postcolonialism and historiography and the contribution of other disciplines like political science, legal studies, anthropology, literature, cultural studies, and economics have been included in the subaltern studies. Subaltern studies cannot be viewed as just another version of Marxist or radical history, but as a post colonial outlook. The author also points out that the discipline of history has not received much attention. In India, there have been several social movements that Western scholars have not included and valued back then. The subaltern studies were thus developed by a group of scholars who studied in the West, and they felt that the literature projected by the other on India was biased and partial. So, they thought of writing their history. Many writers focused on different areas. Ranjit Guha documented how the peasant struggle started or existed. Readings of subaltern studies began in India, where writing about subaltern studies began in book reviews. At first, each volume in the series was reviewed separately as a collection of essays. Still, by 1986, an accumulation of writing inside and outside the project had established a distinctive school of research whose adherents came to be called subalterns or simply subalterns. The essays appeared in paperback in 1988 when Selected Subaltern Studies was published by Oxford University Press in New York and Oxford, edited by Ranjit Guha and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, with a foreword by Edward Said. By 1990, Burtonstein could cite the growing interest in subaltern studies as one sign that the 1980s were a decade of historical efflorescence in South Asian studies. In the 1990s, subaltern studies became an interesting topic in academic circles on several continents. A weapon, magnet, target, lightning rod, hitching post, icon, gold mine, and fortress for scholars ranging across disciplines from history to political science, anthropology, sociology, literary criticism, and cultural studies. In other words, it is giving a platform for the voiceless who have been suppressed for generations together. Here, society is viewed from the bottom to the top rather than the top to bottom approach. We will now look into detail about the few scholars who are associated with this perspective. Ranjit Guha. Guha, in his book Subaltern Studies, which consists of several volumes, writes in the introduction chapter The Complexity of Indian History. Guha insisted that mostly the writings of historians had focused on the Indian national movement, which was also seen only from the perspective of the movement's leaders. All else, he went on to attribute, in the history of our society was left either untouched or not examined enough or examined only as an adjunct of the mainstream of the national movement. What was needed, Guha argued, was a subaltern perspective wherein society could be studied from the point of view of the oppressed, those who were the fodder in the canon of history, as it were. According to Guha, tribals or peasants, insurgents have not to be seen as merely objects of inquiry, but makers of their own history. Subaltern historiography seeks to restore a balance by highlighting the role of the people's politics as against elite politics played in Indian history. The subaltern studies have the immense possibility of projecting, constructing, and analyzing the people's lives, institutions, problems, movements, values, and the processes of their formation, structuration, and restructuration at local and regional levels. The meanings thus need not be viewed from a Marxist perspective, but Indian historiographical and culturological perspectives. Some of the important works of Ranjit Guha is A Rule of Property for Bengal, an essay on the idea of permanent settlement, Elementary Aspects of Insurgency in Colonial India, Subaltern Studies. Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. A critical analysis of Spivak's classic 1988 Postcolonial Studies essay, in which she argues that a core problem for the poorest and most marginalized in society, the subalterns, is that they have no platform to express their concerns and no voice to affect policy debates or demand a fairer share of society's goods. A key theme of Gayatri Spivak's work is agency, the ability of the individual to make their own decisions. Spivak's main aim is to consider ways in which subalterns, her term for the indigenous dispossessed in colonial societies, were able to achieve agency. Spivak is herself a scholar, and she remains acutely aware of the difficulty and dangers of presuming to speak for the subalterns that she writes about. As such, her work can be seen as predominantly a light exercise in the critical thinking skill of interpretation. She looks in detail at issues of meaning, specifically at the real meaning of the available evidence, and her paper is an attempt not only to highlight problems of definition but clarify them. What makes this one of the key works of interpretation in the McCarth Library is, of course, the underlying significance of this work. Interpretation, in this case, is a matter of the difference between allowing subalterns to speak for themselves and of imposing a mode of speaking on them that, however well intentioned, can be as damaging in the post-colonial world as the agency stifling political structures of the colonial world itself. Spivak takes a stand against a specifically intellectual form of oppression and marginalization by clearing away the residue of scholarly attempts at interpretation. Dipesh Chakrabarty has also been an active member of the Subaltern Studies Group or Collective. His contribution towards post-colonial and subaltern studies can be seen from his pioneering works such as Provincializing Europe, Post-Colonial Thought and Historical Difference 2000. This text explores the relationship between history and post-colonial theory. His other work in subaltern studies is titled Habitations of Modernity, Essays in the Wake of Subaltern Studies, 2002. He is a founding member of the editorial collective of Subaltern Studies and was the editor for Subaltern Studies Volume 9 and Shahid Amin. He is also founding editor of Postcolonial Studies. His Provincializing Europe, Postcolonial Thought and Historical Difference, first published in 2000, deals with the mythical state of Europe that is frequently taken to be the original site of modernity in various histories of capitalist evolution in non-Western nations. Dipesh Chakrabarty notes that the relation between subaltern pasts and the practice of historicism is not one of mutual exclusion. Subaltern pasts act as a supplement to the historian's pasts and, in fact, aid our capacity to historicism. They enable history, the discipline, to be what it is and yet at the same time help to show forth what its limits are. Several writers have applied subaltern perspectives in India as well as in the world, though at times they may or may not call themselves as subalterns. However, their works address the issues and bring out the loopholes within the system that he has failed to acknowledge for generations. Though developed at a local scale, the subaltern spread out like a tree branch and has now been used by several scholars in different parts of the world. Let us look at how this concept, the theory, has been used by people to understand their social problems. Subaltern in the classroom setting. A classroom is one of the important secondary groups which a child visits nearly half of his childhood. However, within a classroom too, one could observe a hierarchy. This could at times continue for nearly a decade from the time the child is in the first grade right up to his college. In the Indian context, the divisions could be based on caste or class. Addressing these issues is very important. In the book The Subaltern Speak, Curriculum, Power and Educational Struggles, the author writes about whose perspective, experience, and history is privileged in educational institutions has shaped curriculum debates for decades. In this insightful collection, Michael W. Apple and Kirsten L. Boras interrogate the notion that some knowledge is worth more than others. The Subaltern Speak combines an analysis of how various forms of power now operate, with a specific focus on spaces in which subaltern groups act to reassert their own perceived identities, cultures, and histories. Subaltern and urbanism. Subaltern urbanism tries to understand and transform how the cities of the global south are studied and represented in urban research and to some extent in popular discourse. Subaltern urbanism undertakes the theorization of the megacity and its subaltern spaces and subaltern classes. Of these, the ubiquitous slum is the most prominent. Writing against positive and negative narratives of the slum, subaltern urbanism provides accounts of the slum as a terrain of habitation, livelihood, self organization, and politics. This is a vital and even radical challenge to dominant narratives of the megacity. In a megacity, the slum has mass politics and the habitus of the dispossessed. It has to be also looked from the peripheries, urban informality, zones of exception, and grey spaces. In other words, it could be studied from subaltern spaces. Subaltern geopolitics. The concept of subaltern makes direct reference to post colonial notions of power relations, suggesting a position that is not completely other, resistant, or alternative to dominant power, but instead one that occupies an ambiguous position of marginality. Traditionally, the West had the power to write about marginalized groups, interpret their culture, behavior, customs, and even dictate education and technology. This geopolitics has even continued today. However, a tiny section is like the subaltern groups, questioning these taken for granted rules and practices in society. With globalization, developed countries have further entered into the underdeveloped countries and continue to influence these lands, at times positively and negatively. Subaltern citizen. The representation of the subaltern has to be viewed from the power dimension. Subaltern citizen is not just about the technical question of citizenship. Instead, the claim is about historical agency and belonging in a society and its self construction. It is the fight of 200 years old and more, the struggles waged by the oppressed and subordinated, that is, for the subalterns, it is the struggles for recognition as equals. The history of these efforts appeared as a history of sameness. However, in the later decades of the 20th century, this struggle was extended to encompass another demand, the demand for recognition of difference, the existence of various differences that explain the diversity, density, and richness of human experience. It is this paradox that needs to be answered while debating the construction of a subaltern citizen. How is the long standing struggle for equality supposed to be folded into this newly asserted right to the recognition of difference? Subaltern citizenship can be best explained with the movement of Henry lebrives right to the city, where the marginalized groups are shifted to the periphery with the rise of the center of the city. So, here the demand is that local citizens have to be included while making policies, changing landscapes, and building skyscrapers. This would create a sense of belongingness and cordial relationships among the state and the people. Thank you for watching the presentation. Do like, share, subscribe, and leave your comments about this presentation or any other topics you would like to learn more about.